The legendary groove of the Crusaders was powered by blood, shattered nerves, and corporate cruelty. When their founding drummer physically collapsed from exhaustion, the music industry did not offer him a shred of mercy. He was replaced with a top-tier session drummer, so the touring and recording machinery could continue without interruption. Held hostage by multi-million-dollar contracts, his childhood brothers were forced to smile and perform alongside a total stranger. This is the dark truth of the Crusaders' replacement that triggered a devastating jazz-funk fallout. The corporate machine did not just dismantle a band, it fractured a lifelong brotherhood. The Crusaders were never an artificial product assembled in a sterile boardroom. They were a genuine family, forged in the suffocating heat and strict racial segregation of Houston, Texas, during the 1950s. Long before the multi-million-dollar contracts and the tailored suits, Stix Hooper, Joe Sample, Wilton Felder, and Wayne Henderson were simply boys sharing a survival mechanism. In the impoverished neighborhoods of the Jim Crow South, music was not merely entertainment, it was a desperate, focused discipline. They learned to play together in cramped, sweltering rooms, matching their breathing, anticipating each other's pauses, and developing a telepathic connection. Stix Hooper was the anchor from the very beginning. His drums were the relentless heartbeat of this four-man organism. When they played, they were insulated from the harshness of the outside world, bound by an absolute loyalty because they had nothing else but each other and the sound they created. This deep biological synchronization carried them out of Texas and onto the West Coast in the 1960s. Calling themselves the Jazz Crusaders, they navigated the fiercely competitive world of hard bop. They built a reputation as formidable, uncompromising artists. During this era, the industry was grueling, but the power dynamic was fundamentally different. They answered to the music. They answered each other. The physical exertion of touring in station wagons and playing smoky, dimly lit clubs was exhausting, but it was an exhaustion born of artistic pursuit. They were building a legacy stone by stone. However, the cultural and economic tectonic plates of America were shifting as the decade closed. The 1970s brought an aggressive commercialization of the music industry. Record labels were evolving into massive, publicly traded conglomerates, and they demanded a product that could scale. Traditional jazz was respected, but it did not fill arenas. In a strategic move that would ultimately secure their financial future and seal their tragic fate, the band dropped the word jazz from their name in 1971. They became simply the Crusaders. They pioneered a genre that the industry would later label urban jazz crossover. This was not a minor stylistic shift. It was the invention of a unicorn. They successfully fused the intellectual, improvisational rigor of jazz with the heavy, driving, inescapable pulse of R&B and funk. It was a golden formula that unlocked massive, unprecedented mainstream success. Their records began to sell in the millions. They were suddenly playing stadiums, crossing over into pop charts, and attracting a global audience. But this specific new genre came with a terrifying hidden cost. The physical mechanics of playing urban jazz crossover were uniquely brutal. It was not the loose interpretative swing of traditional jazz, where a drummer could float around the beat, nor was it the simple, repetitive thud of basic rock and roll. This new sound demanded a relentlessly locked-in high-speed groove. It required the drummer to hit with the muscular, explosive force of a funk player while maintaining the rapid-fire, syncopated precision of a jazz virtuoso. For Stix Hooper, the creator of this hybrid rhythm, the drum kit ceased to be an instrument and became an anvil. For 3 hours a night, without the aid of click tracks or digital sequencing, Hooper was the human metronome for a massive stadium-shaking sound. The kinetic force required to drive that groove through the bodies of 20,000 people had to originate from his shoulders, travel down his spine, and explode through his wrists. Every rim shot, every strike of the kick drum was a micro-trauma. As the 1970s progressed, the corporate grip of MCA Records tightened around the band. The Crusaders were no longer viewed as four human beings. They were a highly lucrative intellectual property. The transition from artists to industrial workers was subtle but absolute. The label recognized that the band's signature groove was a license to print money, and they demanded maximum yield. The touring schedules became less about artistic expression and more about fulfilling the quarterly earnings reports of the conglomerate. The immaculate suits they wore on stage were no longer symbols of respect for the audience. They had become the mandatory uniforms of a premium corporate brand. In this corporatized environment, the band was subjected to an unrelenting cycle of recording and touring. The human body is a finite resource, but the legal contracts drawn up by the label assumed infinite durability. A fatal flaw in the system of the modern music industry is the total disregard for the physiological reality of the performer. When an executive looks at a spreadsheet mapping out a 150-date global tour, they see gross revenue and logistical overhead. They do not calculate the cumulative degradation of cartilage in a drummer's knees, the fraying of the ulnar nerve, or the inevitable collapse of the lumbar spine. Stix Hooper was trapped in a heavy industrial occupation, but he was afforded none of the protections of an industrial worker. There were no unions mandating rest periods, no occupational health assessments. The only mandate was that the groove must never falter. The first profound crack in the foundation of the brotherhood occurred in 1975. Wayne Henderson, the trombonist whose sound had been integral to their identity since the Houston days, walked away. The official narratives often cite creative differences or a desire to produce, but peeling back the layers reveals the crushing attrition of the machine. Henderson's departure can also be read as an early sign of how exhausting and unsustainable the band's commercial pace had become. He recognized that the corporate apparatus was consuming their lives, turning their passion into a grueling, inescapable shift on a factory floor. He chose to extricate himself before the system ground him into dust. Henderson's departure should have been a glaring warning siren to the label and management. It should have signaled that the workload was unsustainable. Instead, the system's reaction was purely mathematical. The brand had lost a quarter of its recognizable personnel, which meant the remaining 3 members had to immediately increase their output to compensate and maintain the brand's market value. Stix Hooper, Joe Sample, and Wilton Felder were pulled even tighter into the corporate harness. The trio was now bearing the full weight of a global franchise. As the decade turned and the 1980s began, the pressure on Stix Hooper reached a critical mass. He was a man in his 40s, playing a young man's brutally physical game, shackled to a schedule drafted by men sitting in comfortable, air-conditioned offices. He was hiding the pain, taping his hands, taking whatever measures were necessary to simply climb onto the drum stool each night. The brotherhood that had shielded them in Texas was now powerless against the legal and financial barricades erected by MCA Joe Sample and Wilton Felder could see the toll it was taking on their oldest friend. But they were equally trapped. They were all signatories to documents that promised financial ruin and catastrophic lawsuits if the tour dates were not met. The trap was fully sprung. The Crusaders had built a perfect musical machine, but they had surrendered the keys to a corporate entity that lacked a human conscience. The suits were pressed, the brass was polished, and the stadium doors were opening. The label demanded the high-speed groove, oblivious to the fact that the human engine generating that rhythm was fundamentally breaking down, pushing the band toward a catastrophic medical and moral precipice that would alter their lives forever. The turning point from artistic triumph to industrial tragedy arrived precisely when the Crusaders reached the absolute zenith of their commercial power. In 1979, the band released the album Street Life, featuring the soaring vocals of Randy Crawford on the title track. The song was a global phenomenon, a masterclass in the urban jazz crossover genre they had invented. It dominated radio airwaves, packed dance floors, and cemented their status as the untouchable kings of the groove. But in the ruthless calculus of the music industry, a massive hit single is not a reward. It is a mandate for escalation. Street Life did not buy the band a reprieve. Instead, it triggered a terrifying acceleration of their already punishing schedule. The demand to see the band live reached a fever pitch, and MCA Records eagerly signed off on grueling multi-continent tours designed to extract every possible dollar from the album's momentum. The tours were relentless, with the band often playing back-to-back nights in different cities, flying red-eye across time zones, and stepping onto stage under the heavy expectation of delivering that immaculate high-speed sound perfectly every single night. The raw biomechanical reality of Stix Hooper's performance during this era reveals the true cruelty of the touring machine. Street Life and the band's subsequent hits were not 3-minute pop songs. They were sprawling, complex compositions that often stretched past the 10-minute mark in a live setting, built entirely on a foundation of relentless, driving, highly syncopated funk drumming. There is a profound difference between the exertion of an athlete and the exertion of a drummer in this specific genre. An athlete plays a season and then rests. A touring drummer in a corporate-owned franchise never enters an off-season. By the early 1980s, Hooper had been striking drumheads for nearly 30 years. The repetitive stress placed upon his physique was catastrophic. Every night his body was absorbing the kinetic shock waves of thousands of heavy rim shots and relentless kick drum pedal strikes. It was the equivalent of a heavy industrial worker operating a jackhammer, but with the added psychological pressure of performing flawless, intricate art in front of massive crowds. As the calendar turned to 1983, the human engine fundamentally broke down. The crisis did not manifest as a sudden, dramatic heart attack or a glamorous rock and roll overdose. It was something far more insidious and agonizing. It was a complete structural and neurological collapse. The relentless physical toll eventually exacted a heavy price. While official biographies state that Hooper stepped down in 1983 to pursue solo production and industry roles, the biomechanical reality of the crossover genre suggests a harsher truth. Decades of violent, repetitive motion had pushed his nervous system and joints to the absolute limit. Continuing at that brutal velocity risked permanent structural damage. The human engine had fundamentally reached its breaking point. In a system governed by human empathy, this medical reality would have triggered an immediate cessation of all band activities. The tour would be canceled, the brother would be sent to a hospital, and the fans would be issued refunds with an apology. But the Crusaders were no longer operating within a system of human empathy. They were operating within the cold, impenetrable logic of a multinational conglomerate. When Hooper's condition became impossible to ignore, management appears to have treated the crisis primarily as a threat to touring schedules, contracts, and revenue. They saw a critical threat to the quarterly revenue stream. They saw breached contracts, enraged promoters, and compromised merchandise sales. The reaction of the system was swift, clinical, and utterly devoid of compassion. They refused to halt the machine. This is where the true psychological terror of the corporate music industry reveals itself. The band's commercial success made it much harder to stop because the financial and contractual pressure to continue had become enormous. In the high-stakes world of arena touring, contracts are written with draconian penalty clauses. Promoters pay massive guarantees up front, venues are secured with heavy deposits, and insurance liabilities are astronomical. The executives use these financial realities as instruments of extortion. They presented the band with a terrifying ultimatum. If the tour stops because the drummer is sick, the band, not the label, will bear the brunt of the financial fallout. The threat of crippling lawsuits, the clawing back of advances, and the total bankruptcy of the men involved hung in the air like a loaded gun. The system essentially held the financial security of Joe Sample and Wilton Felder's families hostage, using it to force compliance. The psychological burden placed on Sample and Felder during this period was a form of invisible torture. These were men who had grown up with Hooper in the segregated wards of Houston. They had shared meager meals, slept on the floors of beat-up vans, and built a legacy side by side. Now, they were forced to watch their brother disintegrate before their eyes, trapped in a moral paralyzation engineered by the label's lawyers. They were acutely aware that Hooper was destroying his body permanently every time he sat behind the kit. Yet they were legally and financially terrified to pull the plug. The corporate structure had successfully pitted their survival against their oldest friend's health. The brotherhood was being crushed under the weight of the brand. The final breaking point arrived when it became physically impossible for Hooper to complete a set. The illusion could no longer be maintained. The engine had seized. When Hooper's body finally broke down, the label treated him less like a founding artist than like a replaceable component in a revenue machine. This was the exact protocol executed by the management of the Crusaders. There was no grace period. There was no severance package honoring 30 years of groundbreaking artistry. Stix Hooper, the founding member, the rhythmic architect of the urban jazz crossover, and the heartbeat of the band, was clinically and ruthlessly excised from the entity he had built. He was no longer able to continue in the same role, and the transition appears to have left him physically damaged and personally isolated from the core identity of the band he helped build. The name The Crusaders belonged to the corporation, and the corporation had decided that Stix Hooper was no longer a viable component. His removal was not a retirement. It was an eviction. The man who had given his blood, his joints, and his youth to create the perfect groove was discarded on the side of the road, leaving a gaping, bleeding hole in the soul of the band. But the system did not allow for a moment of mourning. The ink on the eviction notice was barely dry before the executives initiated the next phase of their cold-blooded protocol, the immediate sourcing of a replacement part to keep the cash register ringing. The excision of Stix Hooper from the ranks of the Crusaders was executed with the sterile, remorseless efficiency of a corporate restructuring. There was no grace period allocated for the remaining members to process the loss of their childhood friend, nor was there any pause in the touring itinerary to respect the end of a 3-decade brotherhood. The label's imperative was absolute. The space on the drum riser could not remain empty for a single night. To fill this void, the system did not seek a new brother. It sought a high-performance component. The management immediately brought in Leon Ndugu Chancellor to take over the drum duties. To be explicitly clear, Chancellor was not a villain in this narrative. He was a percussionist of staggering world-class ability, a consummate professional whose resume would soon include laying down the defining groove for Michael Jackson's Billie Jean. He was a master of his craft. Within the tragic context of the band's history, Chancellor functioned less as a new brother than as a highly skilled professional replacement. He was a corporate prosthesis attached to a severed limb, inserted by MCA Records to ensure the jazz-funk machine continued to generate revenue without skipping a beat. The introduction of Chancellor was a masterstroke of systemic control. By hiring a session musician of his caliber, the label effectively bulletproofed the brand against any musical decline. Chancellor could read the charts flawlessly, execute the complex time signatures, and deliver the heavy, driving funk pulse the audience demanded. He was mathematically perfect. But this very perfection was the source of a profound, devastating psychological torture for Joe Sample and Wilton Felder. When Hooper was the drummer, the music was a living, breathing conversation between men who had known each other since they were boys in Texas. They anticipated each other's thoughts. They covered for each other's fatigue. Their groove was built on shared history and mutual survival. With Chancellor, the groove was mathematically precise, but it was a transaction. The music had been scrubbed of its shared history. It was no longer a conversation, it was a highly paid recitation. The true horror of the 1980s crisis for the Crusaders lies not just in the discarding of Hooper, but in the brutal psychological coercion inflicted upon Sample and Felder. Why did they not walk away? Why did they not stand in solidarity with the man who had built the foundation of their success? The answer lies in the terrifying legal and financial architecture of the modern music industry. Sample and Felder were not merely musicians. They were signatories to labyrinthine contracts that bound their personal financial survival to the continuous operation of the Crusaders' trademark. If they had refused to take the stage without Hooper, they would have been in immediate breach of contract. The label would not have simply fired them, it would have dismantled their lives. They would have been sued for the lost revenue of entire global tours, held liable for promoter guarantees, and stripped of their future royalties. The corporate entity used the threat of absolute financial ruin as a weapon of mass compliance. The system placed Sample and Felder in an agonizing moral trap. They were forced to choose between the survival of their families and their loyalty to their oldest friend. The corporate machinery understood exactly how to exploit this vulnerability. By framing the continuation of the tour as an unavoidable legal obligation, the label effectively outsourced the betrayal. MCA Records did not just fire Stix Hooper, they engineered a scenario where Joe Sample and Wilton Felder were forced to publicly endorse his termination by continuing to play the music. They were transformed from artists into performative hostages, deeply complicit in the clinical erasure of their brother. This psychological violation manifested most acutely in the hours leading up to a performance. The dressing room, once a sanctuary of brotherhood, where 4 men from Houston prepared to take on the world, morphed into a holding cell of suffocating guilt. The ritual of getting dressed for the stage became an exercise in self-betrayal. They had to put on their sharply tailored suits, the sartorial armor of the urban jazz crossover movement. But these suits were no longer symbols of their collective triumph. They felt like the uniforms of corporate compliance. Every night, as they buttoned their jackets and adjusted their cuffs, Sample and Felder were physically dressing themselves in the lie that everything was fine, actively preparing to sell an illusion of unity that had already been destroyed. Walking out onto the stage was a daily execution of their dignity. The roar of the stadium crowd was deafening, a massive wave of adulation from thousands of fans who had paid premium ticket prices to hear the definitive jazz-funk crossover sound. But as Sample took his seat behind the grand piano and Felder strapped on his saxophone, they had to look across the stage and face the reality of their capitulation. Sitting on the drum riser was a stranger. Chancler would count off the tempo, the heavy syncopated funk beat would drop, and the machine would roar to life. The music sounded immaculate, polished, and ferocious. The crowd would erupt, completely blind to the fact that they were witnessing a grotesque pantomime. The most punishing aspect of this daily ordeal was the visual mandate enforced by the industry. The 1980s was an era heavily defined by visual marketing, television broadcasts, and the projection of a slick, aspirational lifestyle. It was strictly forbidden to look miserable while playing upbeat, high-energy funk. The genre demanded a visual projection of joy, sophistication, and effortless cool. Therefore, Sample and Felder were not merely required to play the correct notes. They were ordered by the sheer mechanics of the business to smile. This fraudulent smile was the ultimate submission to the corporate will. As Sample laid down intricate, rhythmic piano vamps and Felder delivered soaring, soulful saxophone solos, they had to look at each other, look at the hired drummer, and project a warm, engaging camaraderie to the cameras. They had to nod their heads, sway to the rhythm, and bare their teeth in a pantomime of musical ecstasy. Inside, they were navigating a labyrinth of grief, guilt, and profound alienation. They knew that their brother Stix Hooper was sitting somewhere in physical agony, his career terminated, his body broken by the very songs they were currently playing. yet the contract demanded joy. This sustained cognitive dissonance fundamentally altered the men who remained. You cannot perform a lie of that magnitude night after night without it fracturing your own sense of self. They were participating in the daily desecration of their own legacy. Every time they played Street Life or Put It Where You Want It with the replacement drummer, they were validating the corporation's decision. They were proving to the executives that the original brotherhood was in fact entirely unnecessary. They were proving that as long as the sheet music was followed and the suits were pressed, the human beings generating the art were entirely interchangeable. The audience's reaction only deepened the trauma. The crowds danced, cheered, and bought the merchandise. They did not notice that the soul of the rhythm had been clinically swapped out. To the masses, the hired gun sounded exactly like the founding father. For Sample and Felder, this was the most devastating realization of all. The applause confirmed the bleakest, most cynical truth of the capitalist music structure. The consumers did not care about the human cost. They did not care about the brotherhood forged in the segregated South. They did not care about the destroyed joints or the shattered nervous system of Stix Hooper. The audience was only loyal to the brand. They had paid for the Jazz-Funk machine, and as long as the machine delivered the product, the identity of the gears turning inside it was utterly irrelevant. Trapped in this gilded cage, Sample and Felder were forced to confront the reality that they had lost control of their own narrative. The Crusaders was no longer their story. It was a trademark that dictated their behavior. They had achieved the pinnacle of commercial success, reaching a level of global fame and financial compensation that they could only have dreamed of as boys in Texas. But the price of this success was absolute subjugation. They had sold the groove to the highest bidder, and in return, the system had claimed ownership of their loyalty, their autonomy, and their dignity. Bound by contracts and financial pressure, Sample and Felder were forced to present a smiling image of unity on stage, even after the original brotherhood had already been broken. The immediate financial crisis of 1983 was averted, but the corporate victory was entirely Pyrrhic. The MCA Records executives had successfully forced the machine to continue running. The promoters were appeased, and the global tour dates were fulfilled. However, a profound and irreversible artistic rot had been introduced into the core of the Crusaders. When you remove the foundational human element from a musical organism and replace it with a highly efficient session player, you do not just change the personnel, you alter the genetic code of the art itself. The devastating historical consequence of Stix Hooper's ruthless eviction was the gradual, agonizing sterilization of their signature sound. The band had pioneered urban jazz crossover by injecting the sophisticated harmonic structures of jazz with the raw, sweating, desperate pulse of Texas funk. That friction, the aggressive, slightly unpredictable human push and pull generated by Hooper's physical exertion, was what made the music dangerous and vital. Once the machine was stabilized by the clinical perfection of hired technicians, that danger was entirely eradicated. The rhythm section no longer possessed the organic grit of a brotherhood fighting for survival. It possessed the flawless, unblemished sheen of a studio recording. As the 1980s progressed, this corporate mandate for polished perfection initiated a catastrophic cultural shift. The raw, muscular jazz-funk that the Crusaders had championed began to devolve. Stripped of its foundational friction, the genre smoothed out its edges to appease radio programmers and corporate sponsors. It mutated into what the industry would eventually package and sell as smooth jazz. This was no longer music designed to challenge the intellect or compel the body to move. It was an audio aesthetic designed to be unobtrusive. It became the background music for corporate elevators, waiting rooms, and upscale wine bars. The system had successfully taken the most explosive rhythm section in America and sanded it down into premium audio wallpaper. For Joe Sample and Wilton Felder, the descent into this sterile new reality was an agonizing slow-motion surrender. After the grueling tours of the mid-1980s concluded, they returned to their homes as wealthy men. The contracts had been honored, and their bank accounts reflected the massive commercial success of the brand. But the psychological bill for their complicity was waiting. The recording studio, once a sacred space where the four boys from Houston would argue, experiment, and bleed over their instruments to find the perfect groove, had transformed into a sterile boardroom. Session musicians were brought in to lay down tracks with clinical efficiency. The producers dictated the sound, chasing demographic trends and radio formats rather than artistic truth. Sample and Felder were no longer pioneers mapping uncharted musical territory. They were executive employees managing a legacy brand. They played their parts flawlessly, but the fire had been extinguished. They were acutely aware that they were manufacturing a product rather than creating art, operating under the heavy unspoken guilt that the enterprise they were sustaining had been built on the broken spine of their oldest friend. The history of this era is frequently subjected to a deliberate corporate revisionism. If you consult the official biographies, the liner notes of greatest hits compilations, or the polished documentaries produced by the recording industry, the events of 1983 are heavily sanitized. The official narrative typically states that Stix Hooper stepped down or left to pursue a solo career and production opportunities. This sanitized version appears designed to protect the brand, downplay the human cost, and keep the transition from looking as brutal as it may have felt to those involved. It is designed to protect the brand equity of the Crusaders and to shield the multinational conglomerate from any moral culpability. The industry refuses to document the reality of a musician's physical destruction, to admit that the relentless touring schedule caused severe neurological and structural damage, and that the label responded with an eviction notice rather than a medical intervention, would shatter the glamorous illusion of the music business. The historical debate surrounding this era often pits jazz purists, who recognize the sudden loss of the band's authentic soul, against corporate historians, who point to the continued record sales as proof of a successful transition. But sales figures do not measure artistic integrity. The money continued to flow, but the entity generating it was a walking corpse. This dark chapter also reveals a profound, almost cinematic irony regarding the ultimate fate of the men involved. Stix Hooper, the man who was deemed broken, defective, and entirely disposable by the corporate machine, was the one who inadvertently escaped the trap. Thrown out of the relentless touring grinder, Hooper was finally forced to stop. Stripped of his grueling obligations, his body was given the space to undertake a slow, painful but genuine recovery. Free from the crushing pressure of the MCA contracts, he regained his autonomy. He was no longer a human metronome tethered to a stadium stage. He was a free man. He eventually transitioned into management, production, and leadership roles within the musical community, including significant work with the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences. He outlived the corporate machine that tried to discard him. Conversely, the ones who were deemed functional enough to remain in the system were subjected to a slow, grinding attrition. Wayne Henderson, who had recognized the trap and escaped earlier, passed away in April 2014, his body giving out after a lifetime of navigating the unforgiving jazz landscape. Joe Sample succumbed to mesothelioma in 2014, leaving behind a legacy forever intertwined with both the brilliance and the burdens of the band's crossover years. A year later, in September 2015, the soulful saxophonist Wilton Felder passed away. The men who had been forced to smile through the 1980s, who had carried the heavy gilded chains of the Crusaders trademark until the very end, were gone. As the 1980s closed and the 1990s began, the music industry underwent another technological and economic revolution. The era of massive live funk bands began to wane, replaced by the clinical precision of drum machines, digital synthesizers, and electronic sequencing. The corporate apparatus that had fiercely protected the Crusaders brand eventually realized that human musicians, even compliant ones, were expensive and unpredictable. A drum machine does not require a hotel room. It does not ask for royalties, and its nervous system never collapses. The industry simply moved on to younger, cheaper, and more easily controlled assets. The Crusaders, having sacrificed their original brotherhood and compromised their artistic soul to appease the corporation, were eventually subjected to the same cold calculation that had eliminated Stix Hooper. When the brand was no longer the most efficient vehicle for generating profit, the corporate support vanished, leaving the remaining members to navigate the twilight of their careers on their own. Today, the stadiums that once shook with the colossal weight of the Crusaders' rhythm are silent. The era of the massive touring jazz-funk juggernaut has passed into history, replaced by the sterile algorithmic curation of the digital streaming age. When a listener today cues up a track like Street Life on a glowing screen, the music arrives instantly, cleanly, stripped entirely of its physical context. The modern consumer hears only the immaculate audio file, a perfect sequence of ones and zeros. They do not hear the grinding of bone on bone. They do not hear the frantic, hushed arguments in the dressing rooms, nor do they see the invisible, suffocating chains of the corporate contracts that held the men on stage hostage. The ultimate triumph of the capitalist music model is its ability to separate the product from the pain of its creators. The MCA Records executives of the 1980s are long gone, having retired on the stock options generated by that era, but the systemic blueprint they perfected remains the industry standard. They proved that an artist's soul could be successfully extracted, commodified, and sold, even while the artist's body was actively disintegrating. To truly understand the final devastating legacy of the Crusaders, one must look at the silence that occupied the decades after their peak. For Joe Sample and Wilton Felder, the years following the 1980s crisis were defined by a quiet, dignified, yet profoundly melancholic endurance. They had survived the corporate meat grinder, but survival is not the same as victory. They spent the remainder of their careers carrying the heavy gilded urn of their own legacy. They continued to play, they continued to record, and they were universally revered as elder statesmen of jazz. But the psychological scar tissue of their complicity never truly faded. The profound trauma of outliving your own brotherhood, of knowing that you were forced by a conglomerate to abandon the man who built your foundation, is an invisible weight. Sample and Felder were intelligent, fiercely proud men. They understood exactly what the system had forced them to do. They knew that the immaculate suits and the mandated smiles were acts of self-betrayal required for survival. In their later years, their music often took on a more reflective, stripped down, and somber tone. It was as if, freed from the crushing necessity to deliver the high-speed stadium groove, they were finally allowing the grief to surface. They took the unvarnished truth of their corporate captivity to their graves. When they passed away within a year of each other in 2014 and 2015, the obituaries in the global press celebrated their genius, their chart success, and their pioneering sound. But the obituaries did not mention the extortion. They did not mention the clinical eviction of their brother. The official history of the music industry prefers to remember the men as triumphant architects of a genre, rather than as high-functioning captives of a boardroom. The most profound, almost literary irony of this entire saga belongs to Stix Hooper. In 1983, the system looked at his shattered nervous system, his failing joints, and his inability to hold a drumstick, and declared him utterly worthless. He was the broken component, the liability that had to be thrown out to save the machine. Yet this very act of ruthless corporate expulsion is precisely what saved his life. By being forcibly ejected from the relentless, lethal velocity of the touring cycle, Hooper was granted the one thing his brothers were denied: sanctuary. Freed from the legal terror of breached contracts and the physical demands of the urban jazz crossover, Hooper's body was finally allowed to heal. The process was arduous, requiring years of intense rehabilitation and a complete recalibration of his physical existence. But he survived. He stepped away from the drum riser and moved into the structural architecture of the music industry itself, taking on executive and advocacy roles. He dedicated the latter part of his life to understanding the very mechanisms that had once tried to destroy him. Today, Stix Hooper is the last surviving founding member of the Crusaders. The man who was deemed too weak to continue is the only one left standing. His survival is a quiet, monumental defiance of the capitalist logic that tried to assign a use-by date to his humanity. When we examine the history of the Crusaders, we are not merely looking at the biography of a band. We are examining a brutal, flawless case study of the intersection between human art and corporate commerce. The system that governed the music industry in the 1980s was not inherently evil in a malicious, cinematic sense. It was something far more terrifying. It was bureaucratically indifferent. The system treated Hooper less like an irreplaceable founding artist and more like a replaceable labor unit within a profitable touring enterprise. In the fiduciary calculus of a multinational label, a musician is indistinguishable from a delivery truck or a printing press. When the asset breaks, you do not pause production to mourn. You replace the asset to protect the shareholders. The tragedy of the Crusaders resonates so deeply with older generations because it mirrors the broader trajectory of the modern working life. It is the story of the artisan crushed by the assembly line. It is the story of loyalty and brotherhood being systematically dismantled by the legal and financial leverage of an unfeeling system. The band's descent from a fiercely independent collective of childhood friends in Houston to a terrified, compromised ensemble of corporate employees in Los Angeles is a dark reflection of the American dream, turning into an industrial nightmare. They achieved everything they were told to strive for: wealth, global fame, and historical significance, only to discover that the prize was a gilded cage that required them to sacrifice their physical and moral integrity. The legacy of their music is now permanently altered. The groove that defined a generation can no longer be heard as simply an infectious, joyful noise. It is a complex, haunting artifact. The flawless execution of those 1980s hits is a testament to the supreme professionalism of the musicians involved, but it is also an audio recording of their captivity. When the brass section swells and the bass line locks into that inescapable pocket, we must now recognize the invisible blood on the tracks. The Crusaders built a sound that was powerful enough to move the world, but they were ultimately devoured by the machinery required to broadcast it. They leave behind a dual legacy, an immaculate catalog of unparalleled musical brilliance, and a chilling warning about the absolute ruthlessness of the industry that owned it. The next time the immaculate driving rhythm of street life fills the room, do not just listen to the perfection of the beat. Listen to the frantic, desperate human endurance required to sustain it. Picture the four men in their sharp suits standing under the blinding lights, playing for their lives. Remember that the groove was a masterpiece, but the smile was a survival tactic, and the brotherhood was the price they paid to keep the machine turning.